King Louis XIV constructed the Palace of Versailles, a former royal home, in Versailles, which is located about 12 miles, 19 kilometers, west of Paris, France. The public establishment of the palace, museum, and national estate of Versailles has been in charge of managing the palace since 1995. It is owned by the French Republic and is overseen by the French Ministry of Culture. One of the most well-liked tourist destinations in the world, Versailles Palace, Park, and Gardens see about 15 million visitors annually. On the site of the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIII first constructed a modest hunting lodge in 1623, and then in 1631 to 1644, he rebuilt it with a modest chateau. From 1661 to 1715, Louis XIV transformed the chateau into a palace over numerous stages. It was a favorite retreat for both kings, and in 1682 Louis XIV made Versailles the de facto capital of France by relocating his court and government there. Kings Louis XV and Louis XVI kept things this way, mostly making interior changes to the palace, but in 1789 the royal family and the French capital moved back to Paris. The Palace of Versailles was mostly deserted and depopulated for the remainder of the French Revolution, which also saw a sharp decline in the population of the neighborhood. Versailles was occupied by Napoleon I as a vacation residence from 1810 to 1814 after his coronation, although he did not repair it. Meaningful improvements to the palace weren't done until the 1830s, since the king spent his time in Paris during the Bourbon Restoration, when he was restored to the throne. The apartments of the southern wing were removed and replaced with a museum of French history. Due to the palace's significance as the epicenter of French power, the arts, and science in the 17th and 18th centuries, UNESCO named the palace and park a World Heritage Site in 1979. The palace, its gardens, and several of its ancillary buildings have all been added to the French Ministry of Culture's list of historically significant monuments. 12 miles, 19 kilometers, west of Paris and 10 miles, 16 kilometers, from his main estate, the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Louis XIII, King of France, constructed a hunting lodge on a hill in a favored hunting area in 1623. The location was a wooded swamp close to the town of Versailles that Louis XII's court derided as being unfit for a king in general. One of his courtiers, François de Bassompierre, remarked that the lodge would not inspire vanity in even the poorest gentleman. The lodge was replaced with a chateau by architect Philibert Leroy between 1631 and 1634 for Louis XIII, who forbade his queen, and of Austria, from staying there overnight, even after smallpox outbreaks at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1641 forced Louis XIII and his 3-year-old heir, the future Louis XIV, to move to Versailles. Louis XII's chateau was left unoccupied for 10 years after his death in 1643, when Anne was appointed Louis XIV's regent. She relocated the court back to Paris, where Cardinal Mazarin served as Anne's chief minister and carried on Louis XII's controversial monetary policies. As a result, Mazarin and the princes of the blood, Louis XIV's extended family, engaged in a power struggle that resulted in the Fronde, a series of uprisings against royal authority that took place from 1648 to 1653. Following the Fronde, Louis XIV made the decision to reign by himself. Louis XIV transferred the court back to Saint-Germain-en-Laye after Mazarin's death in 1661, restructured his government to bar his mother and the princes of the blood, and ordered that his father's chateau at Versailles be converted into a palace. André Le Nôtre is responsible for the Versailles Gardens as they have been known since Louis XIV's time in power. The basic garden designed by Jacques Boisseau and Jacques de Nemours in the 1630s was the forerunner to Le Nôtre's gardens, which he reconfigured along an east-west axis that, as a result of Louis XIV's land acquisitions and the clearing of woodland, were stretched literally as far as could be seen. Le Nôtre, Lebrun, Colbert, and Louis XIV worked together to create the final gardens, which were characterized by strict order, discipline, and open space with axial roads, flower beds, hedges, and ponds and lakes as motifs. They rose to prominence as the pinnacle of the French formal garden style and have since inspired numerous copies or imitations. The Versailles Menagerie, erected by Louis Vauve between 1662 and 1664 near the southern end of the Grand Canal, was the earliest of the Palace of Versailles auxiliary buildings. Manset rebuilt the rooms, which look out over the Pins, between 1698 and 1700, but the menagerie was abandoned in 1712. It was destroyed in 1801 after a protracted period of decline. Louis Vauve initially constructed the Versailles Orangery in 1663 as part of the broader earth-moving process to establish the estate, which is located immediately to the south of the palace. Manset also made changes, completely rebuilding it and expanding it from 1681 to 1685. Louis XIV hired Manset to construct the Château de Marly, a hideaway on the outskirts of Versailles grounds that is about 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers, from the palace. The chateau was made up of a main residence structure and 12 Palladian-style pavilions arranged in 2 rows on either side of the structure. Louis XIV stayed there for the first time in 1686, after construction was finished. In 1799, the chateau was nationalized, sold, then destroyed to make way for industrial structures. Napoleon later bought the estate in 1811 after these were themselves destroyed in 1805. The grounds of the Château de Marly were turned over to the Palace, Museum, and National Estate of Versailles Public Establishment on June 1, 2009. A hunting lodge called La Lanterne was named for the light that crowned the neighboring menagerie, which Philippe Louis de Noailles, the governor of the palace at the time, built in 1787. It has been a state residence since 1960. The southernmost point of the north wing is where the Royal Chapel of Versailles is situated. The structure has a height of 40 meters, 130 feet, a length of 42 meters, 138 feet, and a width of 24 meters, 79 feet. The chapel's rectangular shape and semicircular apse combine Versailles French Baroque design with traditional Gothic Royal French church architecture. The chapel's ceiling is made up of an uninterrupted vault that is separated into 3 sections by frescoes by Antoine Coypel, Charles de la Fosse, and Jean Jouvenet. The motifs beneath the frescoes honor Louis IX's achievements and include the monogram of Louis XIV, the fleur-de-lis, and portraits of David, Constantine, Charlemagne, and Louis IX. Gabriel built the Petit Trianon for Louis XV and the Madame du Barry in the neoclassical style between 1762 and 1768, giving rise to the designations Grand and Petit Trianon. The structure features 5 windows on each floor with a piano nobile, cellar, and attic. When Louis XVI became king, he granted Marie Antoinette the Petit Trianon, which she renovated, replanted with gardens in the time-honored English and Oriental designs, and used as the location of her own court. In 1668, Louis XIV bought and destroyed the hamlet of Trianon, which was located close to the northern extremity of the Grand Canal. In its place, he hired Louis Vauve to build a royal retreat that is now known as the Porcelain Trianon. Louis Vauve created and constructed it in 1670. Despite being mostly French in design, it was the earliest instance of chinoiserie, fake Chinese, architecture in Europe. Louis XIV ordered its demolition in 1687 because the roof, which was made of Delftware rather than porcelain and prone to leaks, needed to be replaced. Nevertheless, because of the Porcelain Trianon's success, imitations of it were constructed all throughout Europe. Alright everyone, how did you find Versailles Place? Let us know in the comment section and see you in the next video.